Our gospel lesson today comes from Matthew chapter 5. We'll be reading from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And as is our custom, I invite you to please stand for our gospel lesson. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Praise God for the hearing of these sacred words. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. It was a few years ago now. My wife, my spouse, Leslie, wanted me to take her to my hometown of Lagodi, Indiana. She'd heard me tell stories of Lagodi. She'd heard me talk about Lagodi, and so she wanted to see Lagodi for herself. And so I think I was doing a wedding in French Lick, Indiana, which is not too far away, and then we had some extra time, and I drove her up to Lagodi to show her my old stomping grounds. I showed Leslie where I went to school, Elementary West, Elementary East, and the high school where the Lagodi Lions played basketball. I showed her all those places. I showed her my church that I grew up in, the Lagodi United Methodist Church at that time. So this is where I found Christ, and this is where I experienced the call of ministry. I showed her where I went to church. And then I showed her the parsonage, where my brother and my family and I lived, and where a lot of the stories I would tell over the years had taken place. She's like, "Andy, it's a miracle it's still standing." And I'm like, "I completely agree with you, Les, if you knew my brother and I." And so it was really interesting to drive around Lagodi because I'd not been there for a long time. And the thing that stuck out about that place was this: nothing seemed to have changed. Lagodi specialized in not changing, but there was one important factor that had changed, and that was me. And what became apparent was how much I had changed. And it really stuck out when I took Leslie to go see my third grade teacher, Miss Ackerman. She was one of my all-time favorite teachers. Whenever we talk about favorite teachers, Miss Ackerman's always top of my list. And we had a special relationship. She was part of our family in a big way while we lived in Lagodi. And so I took Leslie over to Miss Ackerman's house, though, and on a whim knocked on the door, and lo and behold, she was home. And she came to the door, and she says, "Andy, come on in." So I come on in with my wife, Leslie. We're sitting there, and we get to chit-chatting it up, and then came the question. It's the question people ask all the time when they don't know what else to ask or say or do. Miss Ackerman says to me, "So what do you do, Andy?" And I paused, and I said, "Well, Miss Ackerman, I'm a pastor." And Mrs. Ackerman responded, she said, "Really?" In third grade, I never would have guessed that you would become a pastor. Things have a way of changing, and maybe the one thing that changes the most is, well, us. We change the most. Today, that's what we're going to be talking about. It's the one constant in all of our lives. How do we navigate the changes? How do we navigate the shifts? How do we navigate life as it inevitably becomes different? We're going through the stained glass windows of our sanctuary in our church. And last week, we talked about the first of the Beatitudes. That's blessed are the poor in spirit window. It's the first one on my right, your left. And in my sermon, I discussed how historically there's a lot of different ways blessed are the poor in spirit has been interpreted. Some people talk about it as mourning our sins, and other people talk about poor in spirit as being humble and teachable. But the bottom line for me when it comes to being poor in spirit is this: we are poor in the spirit when we've come to a place in our lives in which we're ready for a change. We're poor in spirit when we're finally to that place where something has brought us to our knees, and we're finally like, okay, all right, I'm ready for it to become different. In fact, that's the Greek word, or the Greek word that the gospel writer Matthew uses for poor. Literally, poor in the sense that we've been brought to our knees and we're like ready for a change. And today we're continuing our series by talking about, well, the price we pay for going through a change. And what is the price we all pay when we go through a big change in our life? We have to mourn, right? We have to mourn that experience. And it comes as no surprise that the next beatitude Jesus throws out there are, "Blessed are you when you mourn. Blessed are they when they mourn, for they will be comforted." And this window, it's a beautiful window like all the rest. Just, I mean, wondrous, beautiful. If you look at the stained glass window, at the bottom of the window, you can see a person's there mourning. At the bottom, they're reaching up to God. In the middle of the window, there are some images of mourning: a willow tree, a sickle, a torch. And then at the top, you'll see the mourner reaches finally to God, and then the hand of God reaches down to them and gives them comfort in the midst of their mourning. Just a really great depiction of what happens a lot of times when life hurts. We reach out to God, or we reach out for help. Now, here's the thing. There's probably someone here right now who's grieving. There's probably someone here right now who you've gone through a loss, you've gone through a change in your life. And if you're really honest, you've reached out to God, you've prayed to God, and you said, God, give me some comfort here, help me. And it hasn't come, and it hasn't happened in the way that you anticipated. If that's you today, if you're experiencing grief in some way in that sense, you've reached out to God and you didn't get the help you want or need, I want you to know something. You're not alone. In fact, it's pretty typical. When life begins to hurt, sometimes we reach out to God and we say, hey, God, give me comfort. And it doesn't always happen in the way that we want it to. It doesn't always happen in the way we prayed about. And that's very, very normal. In fact, the number one thing I can say about mourning and grief, this is the most important lesson I've learned over the years as a pastor. The number one lesson I've learned is this: change in our life is inevitable, transition is not. Let me say that again. When it comes to mourning and grief, change in our life, change is inevitable, transition is not. So let me talk about what I mean by that. A change is often an external event in our lives. Something becomes different, right? It could be a loss of a loved one. It could be a loss of a job. It could be that the world around us has changed. It could be that our church has changed. Change is an external event. It's something that has become different in our lives. Transition, though, on the other hand, is different. Transition is the internal process whereby we begin to learn to renegotiate and live our lives again in light of these changes that's taken place. And that takes a lot of time. And sometimes that doesn't come easy. That transition piece, that's where the mourning takes place. That's where the grief takes place. We're learning to live again by a new set of rules. We're learning to live again as our relationships changed and as we've gone through a shift in our lives. It's really a three-step process. There's always an ending. Then there's always like a wilderness phase where we have to learn to live again in new ways. And then after some time, there's a new beginning. And I take this from one of the most central stories in all the Bible, the story of the Exodus. The reason I believe we tell and retell that story is because the Exodus moment, the Exodus story, it's all about change and it's about transition. Think about it. The story of the Exodus begins with the people of Israel crying out to God, hey, God, we're in Egypt, come and help us. And what does God do, right? God sends a Moses and a change takes place. And they leave Egypt and they begin to head to the promised land. But they don't get there very quickly. Instead, where do they go? They go into the wilderness. And they stay there how long? 40 years. 40 years. What are they doing there? Well, they're doing what everyone does in the wilderness. They're complaining, they're grumbling, and they're talking about how good it was when they used to live in Egypt. We've all been there. We've all done that. And they circle back around, right? They keep circling back around. What are they doing? Complaining and grumbling and talking about how good it was. Boy, when we were in Egypt, that Pharaoh really took care of us. Hey, when we were in Egypt, man, work conditions were tough, but at least we had a job. Man, when we were in Egypt. And they went on, grumbling and complaining, wanting to get back to Egypt. They forgot the big fact, though, was that when they were in Egypt, they were in slavery, but they'd forgotten all of that. They wanted to go back to Egypt. And finally, after they circled around, finally, after a few generations, and after quite frankly, some people die off, they began to cross over to the promised land. They begin to experience new life. And I think that pattern is true for us individually and as organizations even to this day. There's always an ending, a time of wilderness where we have to really struggle and wrestle. We know we're in the wilderness when we're caught up in this, I wish I could get back to the good old days. And we have to circle around a while until, well, new life begins to appear. And so what can we do to help that transition take place becomes the question. What can we do to help that happen? And I'm not going to give you like any clear-cut, straight answer here. And the reason is because each and every one of us is unique. And each and every one of us is different. I can't just wave a wand and say, this is the answer to your grief. This is the answer to your pain. I can't just wave a magic wand and say, this is the quick way through your wilderness. There's no quick way through the wilderness. But what I can offer are some helpful practices that can kind of move us along the way. And the first thing I think that we can learn from the Exodus story, when it comes to mourning at least, is this. In the midst of grief, mourning, change, loss, it's helpful to have a Moses in our life. What's a Moses do? They help us to see the lay of the land. They help us to understand the rules that we need to live by. A good guide in our lives, helps us to see when we're making mistakes. That's what the Moses type figure does. Now, who's your Moses? Who's my Moses? It could be a therapist. It could be a pastor. It could be simply that it's someone that you trust that's able to receive your pain. Sometimes when a person has lost a loved one, they'll go to a grief share group. That group becomes their Moses. They guide them, they walk with them through that grief and through that pain. Here's the one helpful suggestion I'll give, though. Not everyone needs to be your Moses. And what I mean by that is you don't have to go tell everyone about your grief and everyone about your pain. And certainly we've experienced sometimes, maybe we've done that or seen someone do that. They tell everyone at Schnucks about their loss. They tell everyone at Walmart about their loss. Anyone that they see, they tell them about their loss. They've been defined by their loss. And that's not always helpful. Because a lot of times what happens when we do that, of course, is we begin to push people away as we begin to do that. It's good to have a Moses. Not everyone needs to be Moses. The other thing I'll throw out there is this. In the story of the Exodus, when the Israelites finally get ready to go across to the Promised Land, one of the things they do is they send spies into the Promised Land, and they begin to check out the situation. What are they doing in that moment? Research, right? They're researching the situation. Anybody that's getting ready to go to a new place, a new territory, a new land, they're making a big change in their life, it's important to research it and think about it before we actually act and do it. One of the things that happens in the midst of grief, folks, we can be impulsive, right? The pain causes us to make bad decisions. And what's the spies tell us to do? Well, the spies in the story of the Exodus tells us, hold on, do your research, check it out first, get the facts, then you begin to act. The final thing I'll throw out there is this, and this is really the most important to me. When you're in the midst of pain, midst of grief, midst of loss, you're in a wilderness. The most important thing that's helpful for us to move forward really is our faith. And now you're thinking, of course a pastor would say something like that, but I believe it's true. At the heart of the gospel is this notion that God goes ahead of us to prepare a place for us. These words come from Jesus. When Jesus is getting ready to leave this world, when Jesus is getting ready to leave the disciples, he pulls them aside and he says, I don't want you to have your hearts be troubled. I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to know this. I go before you to prepare a place for you. And that place is not just heaven, eternal life. There are places that God goes before us in this life. There's new life for us on the other side of a loss. There's new life for us in the midst of a change. There's new life that's going to come. I mean, that's what it means to be an Easter person, folks. Easter is not just one Sunday. It's a series of 50 days in which we open ourselves to the gift of new life that God's going to bring. And the question is, are we going to see it? Are we going to celebrate it? Are we going to allow ourselves to experience it when that new life comes? A person that's really helped me to understand how to do this is a mentor of mine, really, that I've looked up to for many years now. His name is Dr. Kent Millard. And I've told and retold his story over the years. Dr. Millard was a pastor of one of the largest United Methodist churches in the United States when he retired. He is such an effective pastor, such an effective preacher, but he was forced to retire because his wife of many years had pancreatic cancer. So she gets diagnosed with a terminal form of cancer. He has to retire early, and then after he retires early, she dies a couple months later. You think about what it was like to be him. All the mourning, all the grief, all the loss of that. Lost one of the largest United Methodist churches at the time, and his companion lost his wife. Devastating. And so what's he do? Well, Dr. Millard decides that he wants to go out and preach on the importance of generosity and gratitude. And so he goes to church, and he preaches on it. And I heard he was doing it, so I said, hey, on a whim, would you come to Tell City, where I was serving at the time? Would you come to Tell City and speak at our church? And he says, yeah, I'll come. I was shocked. Yeah, I'll go. And so I'll never forget the day he came to our house. It changed my life. He shows up, he pulls in our driveway, and it's like that guy was shot out of a positive cannon. Seriously. He walks in, he goes, thank you for allowing me to stay at your house tonight. I'm so glad to be here. Hey, how about you show me the church? Will you take me to the church? Show me the church. Okay, we'll take you to the church. We take him to the church, and he said, tell me about what's going on here. So we tell him about what's going on. He goes, oh, this congregation is so lucky to have you and your wife, Leslie. You're so lucky to have you. All these great things. This is wonderful. It's great. Then we went down to a restaurant and had an okay meal. You would have thought that it was the best meal that the man ever ate. And finally, I stop him and I say, Kent, what's your secret? He pauses and he looks at me and he says, I try to spend an hour a day with God and find something to be grateful for and to affirm in every situation, every circumstance. Folks, that takes discipline. That ain't easy. He didn't just get shot out of a happy cannon on accident. He wrestled with his grief. He wrestled with his loss. It was there, and I'm sure it was real for him, but he did not let it define him. Everywhere he went, he tried to find a sign of life, something to affirm, something to celebrate. The reason why I bring this story up is because just a couple weeks ago, I saw Dr. Millard again. I was at the bishop's retirement gala. Standing there, bishops get ready to retire. And here comes Kent Millard. Andy, how are you doing? It was the same exact person. I said, oh, I'm great, Kent. How are you doing? I'm great. I'm the president of a seminary now. Really? He says, yeah, it's wonderful. And then the way he said it, he says, you know, God's really faithful. God's really faithful. And it's still doing good things in my life even now. And I thought to myself, boy, I hope I'm like him when I grow up. Holy cow. Here at Methodist Temple, we've gone through some changes, folks. And we're in some transitions. This church is different than it was 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago. It is. People that come here are different. A lot of things are different. About 7 or 8 years ago, when I became the lead pastor here, I remember talking to a leader within our church, and I said to them, 10 years from now, if we can average 300 people in worship, that'll be a miracle. He said, really? I said, yeah. If you understand the average age of our congregation, if you understand the cultural trends of Christianity, you understand everything that's going on in our world, if 10 years from now, we average 300 in worship, that'll be nothing short of a miracle. Well, folks, last week we had 270 people in worship on a regular Sunday in April. We're on the verge of a miracle. And it's exciting. There's new life all around us. I mean, yeah, we could think about getting back to Egypt. We can think about the way it was, or we can choose to celebrate the signs of new life. Just yesterday, we had a men's breakfast. We had like 65 people at the men's breakfast. No, we had 65 men at the men's breakfast. Let me just interpret that. We had 65 men at church, folks. Miracle. And the mayor was here. We talked about the good things that are happening in our community. And the men of our church and our congregation is going to adopt a city park. We're going to try to transform it and work with the community there to make it better. I can go on and on. You see it every Sunday, the children here. 30, 40 kids at Children's Moment. Again and again. There's new life all around us. And in the midst of the changes, in the midst of the grief, in the midst of the loss that we all go through, the way we move forward, always, is to be grateful for those signs of new life when we see them. That's it. That's what it really means to see Christ. You've paused long enough to celebrate the new life. Jesus starts out the Beatitudes with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." He says we're happy when we're ready to make a change. Then he follows it up and he says, "Blessed are we when we mourn." He follows it up by telling us, hey, by the way, there is a price we have to pay for every change that we go through. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be it's going to be difficult. We're going to mourn. But the way we find comfort is like that window. We remember the mourner reaching out to God. We trust that God's reaching back out to us, and we claim those signs of new life when they come. I started my sermon by saying I had a mentor once who said, never miss the opportunity to say thank you. Never miss the opportunity to go back and tell someone that you appreciate them. I'll certainly challenge us all to do that day. What can we affirm about any given situation, and what can that teach us about what God is doing in our lives? It's in that spirit I'm going to invite the praise team to come, and as they get ready to sing, I'm going to invite my friend Jason to come, and we're going to receive a new member, make another change in the life of our church. And Jason, if you come on down.